Hi everybody, Stacey Wyberg here, sharing with you today my final project for PME 878. Obviously this course was all about experiential learning, and experience I did. Here is listening to the wind, creativity in the outdoors, also known as playing in the dirt with 13-year-olds. I think most of us would agree that creativity and knowledge, these are among humanity's greatest gifts. And yet often it seems like we know so little of the wonders right in front of our noses. And I think that is especially true for our teenagers. What I noticed about my students this year, and in fact for several years since the pandemic, are that my students seem disconnected from the world and from each other. That despite their reliance on technology for all of their needs, they seem ever more unhappy with the way that things are. And I really wanted to change that. Within my classes this year, I have a total of 45 students, split between two classes. There are a total of 8 designated students, and within the 45, at least 4 or 5 that would be very, very reluctant writers. These are the kids where if you would say, hey, what do you want to write about? They would say, well, I don't know. Also, Class B currently has at least 5 students that are struggling with some fairly major drug, alcohol, and or mental health issues. And so I really wanted to try to build some positive relationships and positive connections with school for those students as well as all students. Background information that I collected from a wide variety of sources tells me that there's tons of evidence from all over the world that experiential learning, uh, learning outdoors, learning within community service projects like school gardens, hands-on learning, all of these types of experiential learning have huge benefits for students and for their communities, as well as for creativity and connection. And after numerous Queen's courses, the connection between creative writing and outdoor education seemed like a natural fit for me, especially as a middle school humanities teacher. This connection's one that has been in my mind since first reading the First People's Principles of Learning. And I think especially those that are highlighted here on this slide really do show my focus for this particular project. It is especially important to me that for my Indigenous learners, as well as all of my learners, I want to make sure that the kinds of learning that we're doing support the well-being of the students and their communities, that the learning focuses on connection and a sense of place. And of course, that for me as a humanities teacher, that it weaves together the ideas of memory and history and story, as well as patience and time. And really, that's what we do as teachers. That's what we're there for, isn't it? So heading into this project, my goals really were to bring students and creativity and nature all together in one spot. I wanted to build connections and creativity as a daily practice or as a habit of mind. So my initial PME 878 questions were a little broad. They were a little big. There was no way I could actually attempt to answer all of those in 7 weeks. So I've put them on hold. They will be what I come back to for my capstone, most likely. Instead, I arrived at this question. Can I use outdoor education to inspire my middle school students to think and communicate creatively about the world? So in my efforts to do that, I took my students and my writing program outside to a garden. But first we needed to make one. And here's how we did it. So in week 1, I combined Diana Crutchley's extreme writing idea along with Gillian Judson's imaginative ecological education, or IEE. I have used extreme writing in the past and found that it works really well with students, but they need a lot of ideas first. And of course, some of my students were struggling with the fact that they didn't have those ideas. So the outdoor component was how we developed these. I would use what Jillian Judson calls a cognitive tool. Like, hey, let's look outside on our walk today for good hiding places for a mouse. And I would ask them questions like, how would a mouse feel safe? And what kinds of creatures would a mouse want to be safe from? And what kinds of places would a mouse like to live in? So using prompts like this, students would walk and talk and begin generating ideas. They would sketch and write and draw little maps and make webs. And when we got back to class, we tried to write for 20 minutes without stopping. And because of the time we'd spent outdoors, in almost all cases, students were highly successful with this. So also in week 1, we were outside every single day. You can see on the left is one of the student pictures from the House for a Mouse walk that we went on. And at other times, we went outside just to play. So we would take bubbles and chalk and miniature soccer balls and footballs, and we would go outside just to play for a little while. So also in week 1, we began to garden. We asked some local nurseries for donations of dirt and seeds and plants, and 2 of the 3 that we asked were ready and eager to help. So we cleared some weeds and made a plan and got ready for some new dirt. By the end of the first week, we had a space ready to plant in, we had dirty hands, and we had some ideas to write about. And that was true even for me as I wrote a poem at the end of that week. Week 2 was a big one. We planted, we had our first donated plants arrive. We had marigolds and tomatoes and strawberries. We spent tons of time outside and generated lots of ideas. And we had a few really warm weeks at this point, and students got really engaged. They were really motivated and they were really excited to be outside. In the second week, we also had Writers Workshop begin. We used their story drafts and we added different idea generation tools. You can see here some story cubes with pictures. There's hot cubes with words, and then there's Dixit cards with all kinds of weird and wonderful images. And we use these as prompts to add more ideas into their original drafts. So we were able to dive a little bit deeper into their ideas, and they got much more imaginative and added in new things. Some of them wanted to go back outside again to add to their ideas, which was wonderful. By week 3, we were rolling along pretty good. I was feeling quite confident. We had a watering schedule set up and the plants are clearly growing. Students were, as I said, highly motivated, and I felt like we were on track. And then I maybe got a little bit too ambitious. I made on Animoto a video to introduce the idea of a legacy. I wanted my grade 8 students to think about what might they leave behind at our school besides their stories when they go off to high school in another year. And so we were getting at the idea of the importance of place. And students were encouraged to think locally or globally to imagine what kind of legacy they might leave behind. And just when I was feeling really good about things, I immediately got sick and I was off work for most of a week. But the good news was that the plants were still growing and the sun was still shining and the students were actually remembering to water. They asked the TOC if they could go outside to water the plants, which was wonderful. When I came back to school the following week and surveyed the students, I was pleased to see that most of them were enjoying what we were doing, but 6 were not, and so I was quite concerned. Of course, I immediately started thinking, how can I encourage the outliers? What can I, do to make this more positive for them? What am I missing? But in reality, the 6 students out of the 44 who were surveyed that weren't feeling positive were saying things like, okay, it was too sunny, it was too hot, it was too rainy, there were too many bugs, or maybe they just had no reason to share whatsoever. So I was disappointed, but the nice thing was that all 44 out of 44 students that were there that day had a story planning sheet with a whole bunch of creative ideas from the outdoor experiences. And for me, this was wonderful. This was a real sign that things were actually working, that my idea had actually helped them be more creative. My possible answers for their, the 6 students' reluctance was that perhaps those students might be complaining just because they could complain. I did ask, after all. That was a student suggestion, and I realized it might actually be correct. Some other possible answers might be to think about hats and sunscreen for the hot days, and also hats and rain ponchos for the rainy days. I was considering things like cutting up some yoga mats to make sit cushions. And of course, it would be great if we had a dedicated shade spot or a tent in the local park. But all of those are things for another year, obviously. I did still have some time to have a few week 4 thoughts. Um, and I guess in some ways, this might be one of the more positive things for me personally as a teacher was that I really did feel myself having the time and the lightness and the freedom to feel more creative myself. And that was wonderful. At this point in week 4, I realized that I was going to run out of time. So I tried a few things that weren't in my plan of action. I read my students this picture book called The Lost Words by Robert McFarlane and illustrated by Jackie Morris. We did another IEE. I took another walk. This was the treehouse one, or the vertical world walk, where students were to imagine living in a tree. And most of all, we really just began enjoying the space. We enjoyed going out to see if the plants had grown, and we enjoyed seeing the other creatures that were out there with them. And by week 5, we really had some well-developed plants. We needed to do a little bit of weeding. We saw, little creatures, as I said, and we listened to the wind. And it was at that point that I really saw 4 different success stories come to light. And so while they are not quantitative stories, they're definitely more qualitative. This is the story of students A, B, C, and D. For student A, when we hit week 5 and we started revising and editing stories, it was really obvious for student A that this was a very reluctant writer who had changed. Suddenly, he had more to say than just a sentence. As you can see on the left, this was a first draft, and the student actually had plenty to say. The student was also really quite engaged in sharing what he had written with other people. He found it really rewarding to ask for and offer feedback, and was actually motivated to keep working on the writing afterwards and to make the writing better, which was wonderful to see. Like I said, this was a student who would generally write 1 or sentence, and that would be it. Another student, student B, found that the revising editing process was also good, but in a slightly different way. Student B was a prolific writer all year, but had consistently not allowed anyone to actually read what he had written. He found it really difficult to accept peer feedback and really difficult to make changes to a first draft. So in his mind, his first draft was perfect, and he was not going to change it for anything. And suddenly, as we were doing this process, we were able to get him paired up with 2 different peers to give feedback, and he was still prolifically writing. So a 7-page story became actually a 17-page story by the time of the due date, and he was willing to take the feedback to make the story and the writing better, which was wonderful. Student C found the revising and editing process interesting because I wasn't sure we were going to get anything from the student at all. I was sure that this student might actually have nothing at the end of it, but I was completely wrong. Even though this student spent much of her time when we were outside writing in these little field journal notebooks that I had purchased, she seemed happy, she seemed relaxed, so I kind of let it be. I thought, no, this is probably what she needs. And we didn't really see any results from her for almost 5 weeks. No one was allowed to see what the student was writing on. She never handed in her field guide so I could see what her notes were. And yet, with a little bit of time and a little bit of fresh air and a little bit of outdoor space, with a little bit of grace added in, this student actually had written, I think it was a 3.5-page story that was handed in, edited on the due date. So it was, again, just one of those eye-opening moments that was a bit of an aha for me. This really worked for her, even though I had not expected that it would. Week 5 was also an interesting moment for student D. This was a brand new student who arrived on Monday of that week. And on Wednesday morning, I noticed he was hanging around outside my classroom really early in the morning, like at about 7:45. And when I spoke with him, it was clear that he was using the garden for his own purposes, not necessarily for writing, because he actually had missed a lot of the earlier stuff there, but he was using the garden to meet people and to connect with peers and hang out with the other gardeners. So by 8:15 that morning, there were 5 of them outside my room, chatting and laughing and taking turns with the watering cans. So by the time week 5 ended, and the lettuce looked like lettuce, I was feeling that we had quite a win on our hands. And then it started to rain. So I knew we were going to run out of time, but I wasn't counting on the rain. So once again, we needed to improvise. So I improvised once again. We used these story kits that I had made, I guess, a year or so ago. And they are filled with layers, one layer for each group, of kind of natural found objects like pine cones and pebbles, and then other bits and pieces, buttons and beads and bits of felt and cinnamon sticks. And what I did is I gave each group of students, 3 or 4 students, one of these layers, as well as a few pieces of rectangular felt. And I asked them to either arrange items to retell in a different way the story that they were working on. And if they didn't like that idea, they could make up a new story. So some students retold and maybe finished, found an ending for their original story. Other students told a brand new story, came up with something entirely new. And so it was just sort of another facet to the storytelling that we did. And it still involved nature in some way, even though we couldn't quite be out in it because it was just too nasty at that point. Also in week 6, we were supposed to have our writer's celebration. So we were supposed to be celebrating out in the garden and inviting parents and so on. But the celebration date that I had picked actually coincided with the revised date for a school-wide activity day. And so we couldn't do it. And of course, did I mention that it was raining? So we took our story circle indoors and did the best that we could. I had my Himalayan salt lamp campfire with stones around it. I had some yoga mats. I had a colleague who was willing to test them for comfort. And so with some twinkle lights and some, ambient nature sounds and some scented fir aromatherapy, it almost felt like we were outdoors. During that time of the circle, we did revision checklists so that they self and peer feedback each other. We did some proofreading with roundtable peer editing. And then students were asked to go back to their rough draft and actually make those changes and make their work better. And at the end of it, we had students with stories that they had taken pride in, that they had celebrated, and that they were ready to actually hand in. So as far as the end result and the main takeaways, for me, the most important thing really was that every student had a story to share, had a story to hand in. This really does not usually happen. And of course, that students were invested in their writing and in giving and receiving feedback. I guess the not so positive side is that I would have loved another 2 weeks maybe to wrap it all up, but we didn't have it, so we had to just make do. As far as the garden goes, I really think that the students have taken on and made this project their own. They now remind me that they need to water and check it. We have a summer watering plan in place with a student and his brother who live just next door to the school, have offered to come by and water it as much as they can. We didn't quite get Garden B developed. That was the front of the school one that we needed approval from the school board for, and we didn't get it. And obviously we need a little more effort put into our weeding plan because that's the one thing that many of the teachers involved wanted you doing as well. As far as the legacy project idea, it clearly needs more development. It needs more time. It's a big part of my overarching theme still, but I guess it seemed a little less connected to what we were actually doing with the writing and the storytelling and the gardening. That seemed like a more natural fit. So the positive side of it was that students really liked the idea. They were initially quite excited about the planning of something that they could leave behind when they went to high school in another year. We were all really glad, I think, to realize that the garden itself is one such legacy. And one student suggested that I could maybe run it as a lunchtime club next year if there's enough interest, and I'd be happy to do that. As far as next steps go, I'm going to, this coming week, ask students to reflect on the experience. We will do a final survey, probably much like the earlier one. And then we're going to do a final reflection on the importance of place. I will hope to solve some of the issues in advance of next year's reluctant students, so the hats, the shade, and so on. And I definitely would want to start earlier in the season or maybe right in the fall so that we don't run out of time. I will also hope to complete my capstone project this summer. Here's that student reflection that I'm going to ask my students to do next week. I will ask them to choose one or more of these big questions in blue and encourage them to think about what it has meant to them to be outside, what it has meant to them to be connected to this place, and what these places represent to them. Things like, how can we carry our special places with us throughout our lives? How can we share these places, and should we share these places? As far as my why will I keep doing this work with students? I think that above all else, even though I don't have data really to support it at this point, students really were engaged. At times when my partner teacher was struggling with behavior and attitude and sending kids to the office, my students really did seem engaged and happy and motivated, not only to be involved with the garden, but also to write. And they certainly enjoyed being outside during the school day. I know I also was genuinely motivated and engaged by the product, or by the project rather. I know I felt more creative when I was outside and in the garden. I felt lighter, I felt freer, and I believe that my students did also. If you have noticed my poems throughout this presentation, there's in some ways all the proof that I need that nature inspired me, for me to feel like I had time in my day because students were motivated and involved in what they were doing. To sit and write a poem while they were in the garden was really quite remarkable. Why will I continue learning about outdoor education and its benefits? Obviously, I don't have any conclusive evidence yet, but I think I have observed at this point firsthand how transformative it can be, not only to be outside, but to be creative outside. My classes came together as cohesive and caring groups, and I could really ask for nothing better moving forward. So 2 thumbs up as far as I would be concerned. Here are some must-have resources. You can see a couple of the books that I've mentioned. Gillian Judson's Walking Curriculum, that's the book that I started with, and I would entirely recommend it as a read. Many of my IEE activity pages came from Adele Conce's Playing in the Muck. This is a book that was written actually as a companion book to a walking curriculum, so they go really well hand in hand. The storytelling kits were ones that I made. I just went to the dollar store and bought little containers with compartments and found things and looked for things and bought different things. And so I have those ready now for next year also. Also, things that I thought were really must-have resources were the story cubes and other idea generation tools, things that will give kids more ideas if they're running out of ideas for themselves. The field guide notebooks and clipboards, I got a bunch of them from the dollar store and ordered them from Amazon. Picture books dealing with nature, I think would be really useful. This one is the one that I read to my students, and I would definitely use it again. It's a really beautiful journey exploring sort of through a woods and all of its lost and hidden creatures, which is wonderful. Definitely outdoor toys like bubbles and chalk and miniature soccer balls, sort of enough for all the kids that you take outside to play with would be really beneficial just to get them comfortable out there and see them acting like kids. For anyone who is interested, I'll make sure that this is available when I submit my project. This is 1 month of daily outdoor ed plus creativity using many of the activities that I used. And the IEE activity pages, the handouts are actually linked to it. So if you are interested in using them, you are welcome to. As you can see, I had a large number of resources. I'm sure by the end of my capstone, this list is going to get longer and longer as it is. Many of these were really informative. The poems and the images were my own. Oh, and actually here you can see there are sort of small versions of all of those imaginative ecological education walks that we did. So those are just attached so people can see them. And there's just some final thoughts here as our time in the garden has come to an end. I think, as I said in one of my reflective updates, the proof's in the garden, I think, in terms of how I felt in experiencing this project. I wanted to connect my students to the world and to each other. And I didn't realize that I would also be so changed, I think. So thank you all for joining me on this journey, and I'll keep you posted in my capstone. Thanks so much.